So, what does this apparent impasse in U.S.-China relations mean for Canada? For a perspective on that, we reached Charles Burton. He's a former counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing and now an associate professor of political science at Brock University. As the United States and China recast their relationship, what do you think that really means for Canada?
Well, I think that if Canada decides to take a different tack, which is as the United States is engaging in a tariffs policy to try and pressure China to make its trade practices more fair and transparent and to cease the covert and coercive and corrupt methods of trying to transfer high technology to the Chinese state, that that won't go well for Canada-China relations, and I should think with other countries as well, because we're now seeing a cross-partisan consensus in the United States that their China policy has to become stronger in opposing China's noncompliance with the norms of the WTO, and we've had some recent statements by the Europeans that they agree. So Canada would be an outlier in this regard, which would make us well regarded by China, but I think in terms of our relations with the United States, it could have quite a serious impact on the prospects of getting the USMCA through Congress.
You've been pretty forceful in your criticism of Canada's attitude toward China. You described it as a sellout. What do you mean?
Well, I don't remember the sellout thing. I think Mr. Harper may have said something like that some years ago on a plane to APEC at Vietnam, but I do think that it's important for us to try and consider the whole relationship, and certainly we have a great concern about social issues. The internment of over 1 million Uyghurs is something that I don't think we can meet the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and not raise forcefully as a cause of great concern to Canadians. And in terms of trade, I do think that we've been inclined to make more concessions to the Chinese than they're prepared to make to us reciprocally. For example, the selling of high tech to China, where they wouldn't do the same the other way, or the state-owned firms of China being able to purchase key Canadian infrastructure in the energy and mining sectors, whereas reciprocally by the Chinese Constitution, Canada could not do the same. So I think that we have to be looking at a reciprocal, fair relationship with China, acknowledging that it's an asymmetrical relationship and ensuring that China behaves in ways in Canada which are consistent with international laws and practices, and that would include political interference and human rights.
But at the same time, you're doing business, and no one's talking about not doing business, but any country that's trading with China is doing business with an authoritarian regime whose goal is to keep that regime safe and sustainable. I mean, it's always the question, right? How do you balance that when Beijing does not want human rights or those kinds of social issues to be part of any trade agreement?
Well, I think that certainly, I think it's unrealistic for us to expect that we can influence China significantly in these areas like environment, gender rights, and other non-trade aspects in a trade deal. But I do think in terms of engagement with China, we shouldn't be doing non-reciprocal concessions to China, for example, with the promise of China opening up its market to Canada, which might or might not be fulfilled, agreeing to Chinese ownership acquisition of Canadian mining and oil sands resources, or the extradition treaty, which concerns us a great deal because persons extradited to China typically are subject to torture and interrogation and lack of due process of law, or in fact removing the security restrictions on export of Canadian technologies, which have industrial and indeed military applications.
When you look at Canada's approach now, and particularly as the government has said it's going to sort of look at sector by sector, but at the same time that could be a wide range of sectors. In some ways, I hesitate to use the word comprehensive, but it would come close to something like that. Is that the right approach?
I don't think that the Chinese government will agree to sectoral agreements. I mean, for one thing, China does not really need more free trade with Canada, as China already has excellent access to the Canadian market under the terms of the WTO. So what China wants from Canada are concessions in these other areas, such as Chinese state acquisition of Canadian resources, and they can't get that through a sector-by-sector deal. So I think the Chinese will likely hold out for a comprehensive deal, which includes many aspects that are in the interest of the Chinese state in exchange for a promise of enhanced access to Canada to the Chinese market. So I'm skeptical of this. And as you say, if we did engage in a sector-by-sector deal, which amounted to a free trade deal, I think that our neighbors to the south of the United States would notice this and see us as working at cross purposes to the current U.S. policy of, rather than opening trade with China, imposing tariffs to try and pressure the regime to change its trade and technology acquisition policies.
You mentioned a moment ago the possibility of Canada sort of becoming an outlier in terms of its relationship with Canada. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, I think traditionally Canada does have a relationship with China which is based on a lot of concessions to the Chinese regimes in various aspects. And there's a historical basis for this. I think that we had hoped that looking at China would give us a vision of how Canada could develop in a way which would be free from U.S. economic and cultural domination. And today, I think there's still some hope that we could diversify our economic dependence on the United States and try and assert a Canadian cultural identity by distancing ourselves from the United States, by becoming closer to China. But I think the costs of that are considerable to Canadian sovereignty and our national identity and commitment to Canadian values like human rights. So I think that we have to tread very carefully in that regard. But certainly at present, Canada is probably among the G7, the country which is showing the greatest reluctance to engage in effective pressure on the Chinese regime to bring them more into compliance with their international obligations in the United Nations and the WTO. And I think that the global community notices this and could more and more not regard Canada as a reliable partner, particularly if we continue to send military-related technologies to China that our allies are not willing to export to that regime.
Professor Burton, I thank you very much for your insight on this.
Thank you.